Hey everyone, welcome back. So today we're doing the truth tables, okay, your logic truth tables. Okay, so there are four types of truth tables that you need to memorize. Firstly, it's your conjunction / and truth table. So when I'm looking for and, I'm referring to your conjunction truth table. Second table is the disjunction / or truth table. Your third table is the implication table. And finally, we have the biconditional table. You must remember these four tables in order to pass test 2. Okay. So firstly, we're dealing with the conjunction table, which is your and, right? And the moment you think, I've got to do a conjunction table, you've got to think about this word, con, to help you memorize. All right? You have to remember this word con. So for your conjunction table, the conclusion is always going to be false unless both P and Q is true. Unless both statements are true, it will always be false. So always think when you're doing the table that's a conjunction, which is your and table, everything is false except if both statements are true. You know, you always got to think, man, this is a con. I'm doing a conjunction table, so everything is going to be false. Whatever information presented is going to be false. So let's get into it. Okay, how do we do this? So firstly, you put your P, and we're going to go Q, and then it's P and Q. Okay, now just a quick note, your P and Q will always remain the same. Okay, let me just highlight this. So P and Q, for all the tables that has 4 rows and 4 columns. So 1, 2, 3, and this of course is our 4th row. Okay, wherever we have 4 rows and 4 columns, P and Q are fixed. The values will never change. Okay, so let's continue. So it's true, true, false, and false. Okay, then we have true, false, true, and false. Okay, then for P and Q, remember, it has to be true. It's only if both statements are true that the conclusion is true. So this is true, and remember we're dealing with con, right? I mentioned this earlier. So since it's con, every other statement would be false, 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 and false. Okay, thank you. And now let's move on to the next video. Okay, sorry, the next table. Okay, so now we're dealing with our disjunction, which is your or truth table. Okay, so how do we do this? So firstly, draw up our table. P, Q, P, and notice it's a V. This V is when you're dealing with your disjunction table, which is or, all right? And when you think of the word, all right, this word or, it's always about preferences. you might, you may, or you may not. Okay, so again, if you recall, I told you P and Q will always be fixed. Okay, so this is true, this is true, this is false, and this would be false. Okay, this would be true, this would be false, this would be true, and this would be false. Okay, if two statements are true, P and Q, it'll always be true. All right, but when I'm dealing with preferences, you always want to think of you may or you may not. So for example, on a good day, you like, let's say you like apples, and let's say you also like pineapples, right? So you have an apple and a pineapple, but you don't dislike it. Okay, so let's say on Monday they offered you an apple, and on Tuesday they offered you a pineapple. What are you gonna do? Well, for these tables, it's always going to be true, except when you dislike both. So in this case, they gave you an apple, you like an apple, they gave you a pineapple, you like pineapple, so why not? On Tuesday, you got offered an apple and a pineapple. You were cool with it. On Wednesday, they gave you a pineapple and then they gave you an apple. You like both. But let's say Friday you're sick for some reason, so you don't want to eat fruits, which doesn't make sense. Anyway, you don't want to eat fruits, so on that given day they offer you an apple. You've already had so many apples and pineapples the whole day. You just no apple, no pineapple, so therefore it's false. Okay, right, cool. So now we're dealing with our implication table. All right, so P, Q, P, this is our implication sign, and Q. Okay, so again, you can tell me if you remember. Before I continue, you can try doing the implication table for P and Q, and then we'll move on. Okay, so this is true, this is true, this is false, and this is false. Okay, true, false, true, and false. Okay, so with the implication table, firstly, let me just highlight this. So wherever you see two statements are the same, it's going to be true. Okay, so here it's true, and here it's true. And then you will always choose the opposite of P for your final answer. So if P is T in an implication table, your final answer is going to be F. And if you begin the statement with F, your final answer is going to be true. Okay, so the implication table, if two statements are true, or if two statements are the same, it will be true. And when the two statements are not the same, your final answer is always the opposite of what P is. Okay, awesome. Now we do our biconditional tables, right? So, one second. So you have P, we have Q, and then we're saying P. Okay. So firstly, we put down what each value is. true, true, false, and false. Okay, that's your P. It will always remain fixed. Then we have Q, which is T, which is F, T, and F. Okay, so these tables are quite easy, actually. These tables are actually quite easy. Okay. So for your biconditional table, wherever you have, okay, wait, let me just highlight this. So wherever the statements are true, what's happening now? Wherever you see two statements that are the same, okay, it'll always be true. So true and true. If two statements are the same, both P and Q are the same, then it's true. And wherever any statement is not the same, it's false. So this is false, and this is false. Why? Because T and F, and here you have F and T, it's not the same, so it'll be false. Okay, and that concludes all of the truth tables that you need to memorize. If you liked this video and found it helpful, share it with a friend, like and subscribe. Cool. Goodbye.